maybe if we can kind of again just kind of circle back to the AI Act. So as I mentioned in 2025, the prohibited AI practices will come into effect. And I'll go into a little bit of obligation around what that is. Also, your general purpose AI obligations will also start coming into effect in the latter part of 2025, as well as the first level of penalties coming in. And then as we look forward into 2026, the rest of the AI Act will start coming into force. And I think one of the key aspects that I want to just bring in terms of the EU AI Act is that it's a risk-based piece of legislation. So what it's looking at is the prohibited AI, high risk AI, limited risk AI, and minimal risk AI. So for the most part, the idea of the legislation is that most AI applications will fall into the minimum risk area, right? There are a few kind of nuances within that, even though you might have a minimal risk, you might still be part of critical infrastructure within the EU. And then that basically elevates or increases the actual risk profile of the underlying asset, as I understand it, right? So I think those are just one of the elements that I think is really important to understand. Just in terms of prohibited AI, so what is going to be coming in from 2025 is social credit scoring systems, something that would be relatively well known within China around the WeChat type systems. Emotional recognition in work and education. So in terms of AI, there are essentially four types of AI. So you've got reactive AI, limited memory, theory of mind, and self-aware AI. So when we start talking about theory of mind, what we're doing there is that where the AI becomes aware of others. Now, technically, it's not there as far as we know, but you are able to infer emotional states within a human. And there is actually a study recently that was done. I believe it was done by Stanford. And within that particular study, AI was actually able to clone personalities. So what researchers did was that they did a series of tests on humans to kind of lift out the personality of those humans, and then they essentially superimpose those personalities onto AI agents and then put them in a simulated world. And what they realized was that those agents started to behave very similarly in those simulated worlds. And the other interesting thing is they then 2 weeks later, they took those AI agents and ran those personality tests using the AI agents. And the AI agents came within, I think it was 85% of their human clones in this instance. And so we're really seeing that coming to head. The fact that we can actually clone personalities, and then from an EU legislation perspective, that is starting to basically will be outlawed as prohibited AI going forward. So what I think is really good is that we're actually seeing that research coming out of major institutes. So it was really a bit of foresight on the EU to actually start imposing that as a prohibitive form of AI, because I think the opportunity for exploitation using that is pretty massive. Behavioral manipulation. Again, I know this is really important from what we saw during the Facebook leaks and Cambridge Analytica. If you now kind of take those kinds of technologies, those kinds of behaviors in terms of big tech, we wouldn't want AI in its current form of technology to start changing or influencing behaviors. It wouldn't work out really well. And then in terms of facial recognition, biometric categorization, and then just in terms of predictive policing, I think is a really big challenge as well. And again, this is kind of minority report kind of thing. But again, you could look at people's personalities and start predicting where and how they would be behaving. And again, it is kind of leaning into that minority report. And we've seen that coming out in some of those research, and then law enforcement using real-time biometric identification in public spaces. So those will be the prohibited AI, or the application of prohibited AI. And the reason why I'm kind of peppering that list with a series of researchers that have recently come out is that I'm actually really glad that this is starting to come out, because if those researchers are coming out, there would be a lot of tool sets and technology that would start to exploit vulnerability, start doing behavioral monitoring, potentially even start doing predictive policing, using those personality clones, and then creating certain scenarios for them to play out in. So yeah, I think that's a really big one in terms of 2025 and kind of looking ahead. I would also say, just in terms of kind of going ahead, there is that I think are really going to kind of light up a little bit, would be AI, trust, transparency, AI governance. These will be areas through 2025 that I think are really going to have a massive spotlight shone onto them. And again, that is pretty much because of the legislation from an EU Act perspective that is coming down the line, as well as specific legislation that is going to start filtering out of the US in the not too distant future. But what was really interesting is that it's also aligned to the quality management systems like ISO and NIST are also utilizing or going along with a risk-based approach. And I also think there is one other call out that I'd like to mention that is also kind of going along the lines of that, would be the ethical OS. Again, not necessarily directly referencing from a risk perspective, but I think that is also an area that I think is going to kind of or at least those technologies and those ideas and those frameworks are really going to come into corporations in a big way through 2025, as everyone realizes that you can't just run out and implement AI. You actually need to figure out what it is that you want to do with the AI. Tool sets, how you're going to use them, where the data is going to come from, how the algorithms are going to be built, what are the ethical considerations, what are the governance considerations, what are the people considerations within your organization, both in terms of currently employed and potentially future employed, how you're going to educate, how you're going to retool the people within your organization to be able to do that. So all of that kind of fits under one umbrella, and I call that umbrella essentially the governance umbrella, because every one of those are essentially pillars to ensuring that an organization is resilient as it adopts these technologies. So that's kind of the legislative piece, and the governance piece and the quality management system piece, if you will. If we get into the technologies, the autonomous agent, I think, is going to become a lot more powerful, because we've got these agentic workflow concepts that have essentially been tested out through 2024 in pilots. We are now going to start seeing that come to fruition in 2025 and going into 2026. Again, what we're seeing is I forgot the exact stats, so just bear with me. But I think it was 90 odd executives, and this was either a KPMG or PwC study, that sees AI as a core strategic pillar for their organization going forward. And I think that is, I think it's almost understated. I think everyone is kind of saying they need to have a look at it, but the problem is that they don't realize that it's going to come literally tomorrow, and those that are going to be ready for it are going to be able to take full advantage of autonomous agents inside their organization. Because if you have autonomous agents inside your organizations running sales, marketing, supply chain logistics, you can move so much more faster than your competitor. And I feel that if you're not in that space ready to run with autonomous agents to be able to give you that edge, I think it's going to be a real challenge. And I want to kind of just highlight one recent study. When I say recent, very, very recent. So this study came out in November of 2024, so 6th of November. Came out of MIT. The researcher is Aidan Toner Rogers, and I just want to just highlight that. Very, very interesting research paper. So in this instance, a large US firm that has a massive R&D lab that focuses on research on materials. So how materials and molecules can be used within manufacturing. So that would be like, from a traditional perspective, it would be things like glue or fiber optics, or it could be graphite. So it's essentially that kind of research firm. So what they identified was that AI-assisted research discovered 44% more material, 39% increase in patent filings, and a 17% rise in actual downstream products of innovation that came out. But I want to kind of just talk to one other thing. So if you're not ready for AI-assisted use inside your organization, you're not going to be able to get 44% improvements, 30% increases. So if you think about that in terms of sales, operations, supply chain logistics, marketing, finance, all of that, if you're not at that point, you are going to fall behind your competition, and you're not going to be as resilient in this transformation period at the moment. There's just one other thing that I want to just highlight, is that using AI as agents, and as I said, I think it's at the beginning phase, and as we go into 2025, it's really going to be very big. And I think one of the misnomers that we often kind of spread is that AI, especially generative AI, is based on old data. And so all it's ever going to do is regurgitate the same stuff, right? So what we've realized through this paper and others is that in this research, the AI was able to create 57% of the ideation process or idea generation. And what was really interesting in the research paper was that the AI actually looked at the data differently, which meant that it was actually able to create novel ideas as opposed to iterative improvements. So what that did was it was actually enabled the top scientists in that area to actually really accelerate into creating those novel technologies. And maybe one other thing that I want to, two other things I want to just mention is that for them, and again, this was kind of, I'm not directly quoting here, but for the lower mediocre scientists within the organization, there wasn't a marked improvement in their capacity within their output. But for the top scientists that were in their domain, that were leveraging AI, were able to get orders of magnitude improvement in their capacity, capability going forward. And then maybe one last thing from this paper, which I think is really important in terms of the agentic workflows that will be coming, that will proliferate through 2025, is that 82% of those scientists that participated within this work actually saw a reduction in satisfaction because they were no longer part of the core creativity process within the actual identification. So they almost had the joy taken out of the real work, which was really kind of finding the challenge, creating the friction, um, and kind of pushing through it. Because I think as humans, we want a task that is just too far away, but just close enough that we can feel like we can get it, and then it's just, and that gives us, like mini micro hero moments in life, and that makes it all really, really enjoyable, I hope. And then I think also just in terms of uh, some of the changes in terms of our hardware configurations, chip technology, and I think we may start seeing other ideas around different model formations. So moving away from the transformer model that we've typically seen, because it's very much a black box, and we need to be able to understand what is happening within that black box. I don't know what that looks like yet. But I think towards the end of 2025, we're going to start seeing that kind of um, model formation coming down the line. I think we're going to start seeing new types of chip technology that is going to be a little less resource intensive for actually running and building and designing those technologies. Probably two, three other areas that I think are going to start coming into being. So the digital twin is pretty well known within the manufacturing space, but now we're thinking about a digital twin of a customer. Now that is interesting. So there was a recent um, procedure that was done on a lady from Portugal in the UK, where she was technically blind without her glasses. And so what they were able to do for her is they were able to essentially create a digital twin of her eye, and then they used an AI to run an AI machine learning platform to run a series of simulated operations on her eye to be able to identify the best operation that will allow her to have the best eyesight. Um, and as I recall, she came out with better than 20/20 vision after the operation. So I think it was 2016, which means that she was kind of at the top line of eyesight in humans. So from going from basically blind to way above average. And that was essentially using the digital twin of her eye. So if we kind of extrapolate that further and we kind of say, well, if we know that we can already create personalities, or essentially a digital twin personality of a human based on their personality tests, and we can do an eye, that means that the idea of a customer, we can actually extrapolate that all the way up to who that potential person is. So again, now you can understand why that EU legislation is in place uh, around policing. So again, you kind of bring it all the way back to how do I create a customer? And so in kind of traditional marketing and sales, we would create a persona. Inside that persona, we would know about uh, Lee, where he lives. So he's South African, living in Dublin, 48. And you kind of build out this view of who Lee is. And then you kind of go, okay, well, how much money, how much disposable money, where would he spend it? And you can start to really kind of build out that idea of who that individual is. So in a corporate sales environment, you could almost target the way in which you write emails to that individual in such a way that they would understand it. You could use the right kind of tones. You could change the amount of people in the meeting rooms to be able to do it. And then in a non-corporate, in a retail environment, again, it gets pretty scary, but you could start to kind of almost change the lighting as Lee walks down the aisle in a supermarket to get him to buy the next cereal. So it just kind of takes that to a whole new level around the persona of who that is. You typically wouldn't want to necessarily bring it down to a hyper personalization in that environment. But in a contact center, that is where you could bring in the hyper personalization. So I think that the digital twin of a customer, I think is a really interesting concept. It's really at the kind of foundational level at the moment. I think spatial computing and humanoid working robots, those two pieces of technology, I think are going to start becoming a lot better understood through 2025 and probably not really implemented until 2026, 2027. But I think those two pieces of technology, so if we can actually bring effectively everything that we've learned around large language models, we bring it out of the form factor of us typing at a prompt, because that's essentially where we're at right now. It's almost like the internet in 1993, where you were basically at a prompt, you could still get the stuff out, but it's not locked behind closed doors or in corporates or anything like that, right? So we've got an interface. I think the next interface up from that is going to be within those form factors within the robots. And what that will allow is almost to be able to start interacting with humanoid type robots. But again, we're still at the infinite kind of really infant stage. Some of those robots have started to break out of the research and development labs. So if you look at Tesla with their robots that they've recently launched, Boston Dynamics with theirs, those are the top ones. There was one other that I had at the top of my mind that escapes my memory at this point. But yeah, I think those going into 2025 is really going to be particularly interesting. I think there are other areas, as I mentioned, around data and the way in which we're going to be using data is also going to change. So we're not going to just concern ourselves with the written format of data. We almost want the AI to be able to kind of take in that information in real time, which I'm going to now bring in one piece of kind of large language model technology changes that I think is going to happen. So this year we saw with GPT-4o and O1, just in terms of inference. So test time compute is where large language models can, in almost real time, improve on their responses. And then we've now got something, instead of test time compute, we've got test time training. And so this is where the actual large language model is able to actually, and this is not within an agentic workflow where it's actually using RAG type architecture to improve and contextualize the output. This is at a frontier level where you're almost able to actually take in more information that will actually take in more data. That data is stored in memory. The prompt then triggers, which then creates the generated outcome. The large language model will then be able to essentially contextualize that within the information that is being provided within memory, and then update its own output. So it's not necessarily changing the underlying weights permanently, but what it is doing is it's updating the weights for that response in real time. And so what that does is that it actually speeds up the process slightly. So you don't necessarily need the amount of compute, because it's essentially going into memory and you're updating the weights inside the model. And I think those kinds of changes are going to almost become mainstream going forward in models coming out, which again has a bit of a knock-on effect in terms of agents coming down the line in terms of technology, because the agents is really where we would typically actually engage with AI outside of a prompt environment. So Those would be the really big changes.